The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
After 9 years of these NDP Liberals, almost 50% of young Canadians believe they will never own a home. This Liberal housing accelerator is an absolute joke. Common sense Conservatives have a plan. They're going to axe the GST on new home builds. On an $800,000 house, this will save $40,000. Wow. And the Conservative leader has now written to the premiers of every province asking them to match this tax cut. When will these NDP Liberals finally get it through their heads? They're funding bureaucracies, axe the tax on new builds so young people can buy a house.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
He says the Housing Accelerator Fund is a joke, Mr. Speaker. Has he consulted with his caucus? A dozen, probably more, Conservative members have advocated specifically for that program. They went behind the back of the Leader of the Opposition because they wanted to advocate for their constituents to see more homes built. By calling for the end of the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is how they would pay for this new, bold idea, so-called, they would end support to communities for homelessness. They would end support for more building for middle-class Canadians. Mr. Speaker, it's an unacceptable, untenable position.
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
Oh man, here's what Liberal housing advisor Mike P. Moffat said about the Liberal housing accelerator. Can anyone in the federal government tell me why Toronto deserves $471 million in housing accelerator funds to massively hike development taxes? And housing starts in Toronto are down 20%. Even Liberal advisors know the housing accelerator's a joke. Will these NDP Liberals finally realize they're funding bureaucracies, tripling development charges, and not getting any houses built for young Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Young Canadians, he talks about home building in Canada, Mr. Speaker. They have 6 homes to point to when they were in office. Wow. That's the sum total of their work when they were in office, when the Leader of the Opposition held the so-called role of Minister of Housing. He wasn't a minister at all, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if you look at the 190,000 number that they talk about during their time in office, that was home builders who did that, Mr. Speaker. It was not them. They know nothing about getting homes built. They know only about cuts. They would only make cuts to communities. It's not an acceptable position, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Parry Sound, Muskoka.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, we know they're not worth the cost of housing. So bad is their record, in fact, that 80% of young Canadians believe that home ownership is only for the very rich. Conservatives will axe the federal sales tax on new homes sold under $1 million, saving Canadians up to $50,000 or $2,200 a year in mortgage payments. The Conservative leader has written premiers asking them to match our Conservative plan to axe the tax on housing, saving Canadians thousands more. This means real relief for young Canadians desperately trying to buy a home. Will the NDP Liberals axe the tax on housing so young Canadians can finally buy a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I worked with the Honourable Member on the House of Commons committee that's responsible for housing. He almost always brings up good points, except today there's a credibility issue at stake, Mr. Speaker. When he was Mayor of Huntsville, prior to becoming Member of Parliament, he increased development charges, which we agree are an impediment to home building. They are a tax on home building. How much did he increase development charges, Mr. Speaker? Not by 2 or 3%, Mr. Speaker, but by 16%, Mr. Speaker. They can't speak about these issues. They have no credibility on the matter.
Order. The honourable member from Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when I was on council, we actually cut development charges by 50%, and I also knew as a mayor that if you get bureaucracy out of the way, you get more homes built. These guys don't understand that, though. All they're doing is funding the bureaucracy. Since this minister has given billions of dollars to cities all across this country, they've raised development charges and housing starts have dropped. Our common sense plan will save Canadians up to $50,000 on a new home. This is real relief for Canadians. So why can't they get on board and axe the tax on new homes?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, like former Conservatives, people like Joe Clark, for example, I recognize that Canada is a community of communities. And as an urban-based MP, I want to assure the honourable member opposite that I read the Huntsville Doppler, the newspaper of record in this community. He increased development charges by 16%. It was reported time and again in that newspaper, Mr. Speaker. They want to cut support for communities. They want to cut support for housing. Don't be fooled. The Leader of the Opposition ditched his glasses. Same guy that wants to cut pensions, support for housing, support for young people, support for EI. They're not serious, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Bellechasse.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, the Bloc Liberal Coalition has discouraged young people from owning their own home. They've doubled rents, mortgage payments, and down payments. As we speak, 80% of Canadians think home ownership is only for the very rich. Our leader has tabled a common-sense proposal, cut the GST on new homes. This idea has the support of CORPIC, the Quebec Residential Rental Properties Owners Association. Will the Bloc-backed Liberals scrap the federal tax on housing, or will they keep on funding their own programs that don't build any houses? The Honourable Minister for the Economic Development Agency. Mr. Speaker, my colleague's proposal is completely ill thought out because not only does it not deal with any increase in the supply of housing, it also comes at the expense of the poorest. Their agenda is clear now. They want to help people who want to buy, but cut back for people in need. I'd like to know from my colleague, the housing in her own riding, how is she going to explain to her constituents that she would cut and put in danger the rents of the people who need that housing? The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. She can ask questions when she's in opposition. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader's proposal to scrap the GST on houses under $1 million would give young people the hope of being able to buy a home and maybe start a family. With this GST cut, some 30,000 new homes could be built. For an $800,000 home, for example, the GST savings would be $40,000. What's keeping this Liberal bloc government from showing a little compassion and common sense by going ahead with our proposal? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Three things. First of all, and my colleague knows this, the Conservative leader was responsible for the construction of only 6 housing units during his entire term. Last week, an agreement was what the Conservatives would do would be cutting a deal that has led to the building of thousands of units in Quebec, including units for seniors in need in the members' riding. That's the type of thing the Conservatives would like to cut that later.
After 9 years of these NDP Liberals, they are not worth the cost of housing. 50% of young Canadians have abandoned the dream of buying a home one day. Rent, mortgage, and down payment costs have all doubled. Common sense Conservatives will axe the federal sales tax on new homes sold. On an $800,000 house, this will save home buyers $40,000 or $2,200 a year in mortgage payments. Our plan means more housing for young Canadians desperately trying to enter the housing market for the first time. Will the NDP Liberals axe the GST on housing for more young Canadians so they can finally buy a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, as we've seen, the Conservatives continue to say that they'll make cuts to pay for their proposals, including this GST initiative, so-called. So what will that mean? It means the accelerator fund will come to an end. The member is from Kelowna. A few weeks ago, I met with Kelowna's Mayor Tom Dias, who shared with me that federal funding secured through the Housing Accelerator Fund has led to a digital permit system that's improved approvals that would have taken even a year ago, a year and a half plus to approve. That approval permit process now is less than 10 days, Mr. Speaker. Huge change.
The Honourable Member from Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, even the Liberal housing advisor, Mike P. Moffat, on the failed Liberal housing plan said the federal Liberals have lost the plot. Habitat for Humanity said reducing GST would reduce costs. Canadian Home Builders Association said it will make a big difference. Canadian Real Estate Association said this proposed step is a positive move forward, lowering building costs, increasing housing supplies, and making home ownership more attainable for Canadians. Will the NDP Liberals axe the GST on housing so more young Canadians can finally buy a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the simple answer is the Conservative policy on housing is a dud. That's the bottom line, Mr. Speaker. And let me tell you about an issue that Canadians are truly concerned about. You have the leader of the Conservative Party that continues to refuse to get a security clearance. I believe Canadians have a right to know why it is that the Conservative leader refuses to get it. What is he hiding? Is there something about his past that Canadians should know about? It's time the leader step up and be honest with Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Mission Maskey Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of NDP Liberals, they are simply not worth the cost of housing. There are encampments all over the city of Abbotsford, including our beloved Cenotaph. Young people are feeling hopeless, knowing that even with a good salary, they will not be able to afford a new house. Conservatives understand that, and that's why we've proposed to a federal GST on new homes, a tax cut that will spark 30,000 new developments. Will the NDP Liberals axe the federal GST on housing so more young Canadians can finally buy a home?
There you go. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
They want to pay for this idea by slashing the Housing Accelerator Fund. So let's understand what that means, Mr. Speaker. This is support for communities across the country, large and small. Support for communities to get people off the street and into homes. Support for zoning changes that will allow for more building. Giving young people, the ones that they talk about and claim to care about here today, more options. You give people more options, the the costs come down, Mr. Speaker. Infrastructure support, so that water connections, for example, can be connected to housing. They don't believe in that either. Support for vacant buildings to be converted into housing, Mr. Speaker. All of this is on the table.